Hi everyone and welcome to What's Happened, the easiest way to keep up to date with what matters in science news. Let's start with some of the biggest news this week, and that's that we've just found a giant hole in the Great Pyramid of Giza. We don't currently know what purpose this void had, whether it was for structural stability or there's something stored inside it. But what we do know is a bit about the cool science that went into discovering it. It was discovered using quite a new technique called muography. What this does is it detects a kind of subatomic particle called a muon. Now muons are just particles in the atmosphere that have been hit by cosmic rays, but they are unusually penetrative. What this means is it can pass through most man-made materials as well as natural materials very easily. Based on how easily these muons can penetrate a substance, we can pretty much calculate its density and whether there are any gaps in it. The more muons we detect, the lower the density of the substance, or the larger and more significant the void or gap is. This technique hasn't only been applied here though. It's been used to look at volcanoes and glaciers as well as the Fukushima power plant, which went into meltdown a few years ago. The group of scientists that discovered the void in the Great Pyramid are currently in talks with archaeologists to work out what to do next, to find out whether or not this void is important or not. And moving swiftly on, we have some fantastic news for all of you space geeks out there. So this week we found out that there's more habitable planets than we'd initially thought. 20 more of them to be exact. These were all discovered by the Kepler program, which was run by NASA. And these planets were all very different. Some of them had very short orbits of around 19 days, and there was one planet of note that had an orbit of about 395 Earth days. And it's this one that's probably the most notable. It's called KOI 7923.01, which stands for Kepler Object of Interest. Why this planet is so important is that it actually has a climate quite similar to some parts of Earth. What we're talking about here are the poles. So yes, it's incredibly cold, but there is still the capacity for it to hold liquid water and subsequently harbour life. It's also about 97% of the size of Earth, but it's about 730 million light years away, so it's highly unlikely we'll ever meet up with our cosmic brethren. But as my mum always said, where there's a will, there's a way. Moving on to some slightly less pleasant news, it turns out that Alzheimer's may be transmittable through blood. Alzheimer's is basically a disease which is caused by a mutation in some of the proteins in your body. And these proteins specifically are called amyloid fibrils. Now, the problem with these is that they can self-replicate, so any significant changes that happen to them aren't necessarily going to be properly regulated by your body. And in the case of some specific mutations, they begin to aggregate together and form these things called amyloid plaques, which you should be able to see here. We don't know whether these amyloid plaques are a cause or an effect of Alzheimer's disease, but what we found out this week may tip the balance in favour of the former. A group of scientists attached one mouse which had a very similar disease to Alzheimer's to a healthy mouse, so that they shared the same blood circulation system. Within a very short period of time, the amyloid fibril proteins were found in the healthy mouse's brain, and then within only 4 months, the healthy mouse began to lose its memory and lose its learning capacity, which are of course symptoms of Alzheimer's. The fact that Alzheimer's could transmit from a diseased mouse to a healthy one causes a few concerns for people in the medical profession, because it shows that these amyloid proteins can act as infectious agents, a lot like prions, such as the one that causes bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease. Prions, much like these amyloid fibrils, can self-replicate, and they do this incredibly quickly, causing a huge amount of damage in a very short space of time. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel. And that's that because of this study, we've realised that the mutated amyloid proteins are actually found in the blood. And therefore, well before this study, we were struggling to treat Alzheimer's because the drugs we want to use can't actually get to the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. We now may be able to treat Alzheimer's by focusing on the amyloid proteins while they're in the blood itself. And moving swiftly on from that, we've got some more promising news. 126 countries came together this week to sign a pact on the preservation of sharks and other migratory species. Most notably, this gives whale sharks, which are incredibly vulnerable due to their migratory nature, a chance to spring back to a stable level of population. Blue sharks will also hugely benefit from this legislation, as currently 30 million of them are fished up every single year. The aim of this pact is to ban or at least reduce the amount of fishing of these species. And finally, drifting into some tech news, today marks the launch of the iPhone X, as this year is the 10th anniversary of the first iPhone launched by Steve Jobs. It features an edge-to-edge Super Retina OLED display and the ability to turn yourself into a poo using their most high-tech facial recognition software. But if you're a tech nerd, it's something you should definitely try to pick up if you haven't already, assuming that you've got a month's salary lying around somewhere. And that's what happened this week in science and tech news. Thank you for joining me, I love you all, and I will see you at the same time next week. Ta-ra!